February 12, 1944. Imperial Japanese Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. The intelligence officer spread the documents across the conference table with hands that moved too carefully, the way a man handles evidence of his own mortality. Photographs of American shipyards. Production schedules, technical specifications, all captured during recent operations in the Marshall Islands. The admirals leaned forward, scanning the pages with the focused intensity of men whose entire strategic framework was about to collapse. The numbers seemed impossible. USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Yorktown, 872 feet of flight deck on each vessel, 27,100 tons standard displacement, 90 aircraft per carrier, and most troubling of all, the construction timeline, 14 to 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. One admiral reached for a particular photograph. It showed the Norfolk Navy Yard with 3 Essex-class carriers in various stages of construction, their massive hulls dominating the landscape like sleeping giants. The American industrial machine wasn't just building these ships, it was mass-producing them with an efficiency that Japanese shipyards, even at full wartime capacity, could never match. The realization didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It came as a creeping dread, the slow recognition that Japan had entered a war against an opponent whose production capacity rendered traditional naval calculations meaningless. The documents had been captured 3 weeks earlier, during the American assault on Kwajalein Atoll. Japanese defensive positions there had included an intelligence collection facility, monitoring American radio traffic and compiling information on Allied naval construction. When American forces overran the position, they'd naturally secured the intelligence materials. But in the chaos of combat, some documents had been scattered, and a Marine intelligence officer had recognized their potential value. What he'd discovered proved far more valuable than anticipated. The Japanese had compiled exhaustive assessments of American carrier construction based on multiple intelligence sources, reconnaissance photographs taken by long-range flying boats operating from Wake Island before its capture, technical specifications gleaned from captured American technical manuals found aboard damaged ships, intercepted communications between shipyards and Navy bureaus discussing construction timelines and material allocations. The assessment was comprehensive, detailed, and absolutely devastating in its implications. The lead intelligence officer, Captain Takeo Yoshikawa, had spent 20 years in naval construction before transferring to intelligence work. He understood shipbuilding at a fundamental level, the logistical requirements, the engineering challenges, the resource allocations necessary to build capital ships. His analysis of the American program was methodical and thorough, and it confirmed what some officers had begun to suspect but few wanted to acknowledge. The Essex-class represented a paradigm shift in naval warfare, not through superior technology alone, but through systematic application of American industrial philosophy to warship construction. Yoshikawa began his briefing with context the admirals already knew but needed to hear stated plainly. In 1941, when we struck Pearl Harbor, the United States possessed 7 fleet carriers: Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, Wasp, Ranger, and Hornet. We assessed this force as manageable. Our own carrier strength numbered 10 fleet carriers, and we believed our superior pilot training and combat experience in China gave us decisive advantages. He paused, letting them absorb the past tense. Believed. Assessed. The language of assumptions proven false. By June 1942, at Midway, we had lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the finest ships in the Kido Butai, destroyed by American dive bombers in less than 6 hours. This was catastrophic but not necessarily fatal. We still possessed Shokaku, Zuikaku, and several light carriers. We could rebuild. Another pause. The admirals sat motionless. We did not understand what rebuilding meant for our enemy. Yoshikawa displayed the first production chart. It showed American carrier construction from 1940 to 1944. The line climbed steadily, then explosively. Essex was commissioned December 31, 1942. Yorktown followed in April 1943. Then came Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Monterey, Langley, Cabot, Bataan, San Jacinto. He let the names wash over them. Each name represented not just a ship but an entire air wing. 90 aircraft, 400 aviators and support personnel, anti-aircraft batteries that could destroy attacking aircraft at ranges Japanese carriers couldn't match. By the end of 1943, the Americans had commissioned 11 Essex-class carriers. In 1944, they will commission at least 6 more, perhaps 8. Our intelligence suggests they may ultimately build 24 of these vessels. The silence in the room felt physical. 24 Essex-class carriers represented more combat power than Japan could deploy in every category simultaneously. Takeda spoke what everyone was thinking. How is such production possible? We possess excellent shipyards. Our workers are skilled. Our engineers understand carrier design as well as any in the world. Yet we completed only one fleet carrier, Taiho, since the war began. 1. They build more than that every 3 months. Yoshikawa had anticipated this question. His answer would define the briefing. The Americans do not build carriers the way we build carriers. They build them the way Ford builds automobiles. I have studied their methods extensively based on these documents and previous intelligence. The differences are fundamental. He displayed technical drawings of an Essex-class carrier's construction. Consider the flight deck. Our carriers use teak planking over structural steel. Beautiful work, requiring skilled carpenters and considerable time. Essex-class carriers use Douglas fir, a softer wood that's easier to work and available in massive quantities from Pacific Northwest forests. Their flight decks are functional rather than refined, but they can be constructed faster with less skilled labor. The hull construction reveals similar thinking. We use complex frame structures requiring precise fitting. American shipyards employ modular construction. They build large sections separately, then move them into position and weld them together. Each section can be worked on simultaneously by different teams. This parallelizes the construction process in ways traditional shipbuilding never achieved. Another admiral, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, studied the production photographs. These modular sections, they sacrifice structural strength? Yoshikawa shook his head. No, sir. If anything, welded construction is stronger than our riveted hulls. The Americans developed advanced welding techniques for their Liberty ship program. They applied those same methods to carrier construction. The result is both faster and more robust. Fukudome absorbed this. And the internal systems, the machinery, electrical, damage control? Standardized wherever possible, Yoshikawa explained. Essex-class carriers share propulsion systems with Cleveland-class cruisers. This means common spare parts, common training, common maintenance procedures. A machinist's mate who learned his trade on a cruiser can service carrier engines without retraining. They've deliberately designed for interchangeability. He displayed electrical system schematics. Look at this wiring diagram. Color-coded throughout, clearly labeled junction boxes. Standardized voltage across all systems. Compare this to our carriers, where each ship has unique characteristics requiring specialized knowledge. American damage control parties can move between ships without confusion because every Essex-class carrier is essentially identical. Admiral Takeda studied the maintenance sections. They built for their farm boys and factory workers the same approach as their Jeep program. Precisely, Yoshikawa confirmed. American military philosophy assumes rapid expansion, requiring semi-skilled personnel. They design everything from the start for operation and maintenance by people with minimal training. Our philosophy assumes elite professionals operating sophisticated equipment. Under peacetime conditions, our approach produces superior results. Under wartime conditions, theirs does. Another officer spoke. But surely there must be weaknesses we can exploit. The Americans sacrifice quality for speed. There must be vulnerabilities. Yoshikawa had prepared for this question too. The flight deck is unarmored, true, A direct bomb hit can damage it severely, as we saw with USS Franklin when our aircraft struck her. But damage control procedures on Essex-class carriers are extraordinarily effective. Franklin suffered massive fires and secondary explosions, lost over 700 men, yet survived and reached port under her own power. The ship was too tough to die. Their anti-aircraft batteries, he continued, represent perhaps the most significant capability gap. Each Essex-class carrier mounts 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin turrets, supplemented by over 70 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns. More importantly, they possess VT proximity-fused ammunition. These shells detonate automatically when near an aircraft. They've essentially made aerial attacks against their carriers incredibly costly. The briefing continued for 3 hours. Yoshikawa walked them through every aspect of Essex-class capabilities. The deck-edge elevator that increased hangar efficiency. The side armor belt is designed against torpedo hits. The 220,000 gallons of aviation fuel storage, carefully compartmentalized and protected. The 3 catapults that could launch aircraft at rates Japanese carriers couldn't match. But the most devastating section came when he addressed comparative production capacity. Our shipyards in Kure, Yokosuka, Nagasaki, and Sasebo represent Japan's primary naval construction capability. Even operating at maximum wartime efficiency, we can build perhaps 2 fleet carriers per year. The Americans operate 7 major naval shipyards, each capable of constructing multiple carriers simultaneously. Newport News, Philadelphia, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Norfolk, Bethlehem Steel, Quincy, Fall River Shipyard, and New York Shipbuilding. Beyond naval yards, they've mobilized commercial shipbuilding capacity. Kaiser Shipyards alone employs over 100,000 workers building cargo ships, escort carriers, and other vessels. Henry Kaiser's Liberty Ship program completes a 10,000-ton cargo vessel every 42 days. They've industrialized shipbuilding the way we would manufacture trucks. Mathematics became inescapable. Japan, straining its industrial capacity to the absolute limit, could not build carriers faster than America destroyed them. Meanwhile, American production accelerated monthly. By mid-1944, Task Force 58 under Admiral Mitchell would operate 15 fleet carriers, including 6 Essex-class vessels. No Japanese force could challenge such concentration of power. If we cannot match their construction, we must prevent them from bringing these carriers into effective combat. Our submarine force must target them in transit. Our land-based aviation must strike them when they approach our defensive perimeter. We need to sink these ships faster than they can build them. Yoshikawa's response was careful. Our submarine force has achieved some successes, but American anti-submarine warfare has improved dramatically. Their destroyers and escort carriers hunt our submarines with increasing effectiveness. Regarding land-based aviation, American carrier aircraft have proven consistently superior to our defensive forces. At Rabaul, at Truk, in the Gilberts and Marshalls, their strikes devastate our airfields before our planes can respond effectively. Another officer tried a different approach. Perhaps we should focus on destroying their industrial capacity. Strategic bombing of these shipyards would cripple their production. The thought was desperate, and everyone in the room knew it. Japan lacked the long-range bombers and pilot strength for sustained strategic bombing campaigns against American territory. Their submarine fleet couldn't interdict shipping effectively enough to matter. The industrial disparity was simply too vast to overcome through military action alone. The briefing concluded with Yoshikawa's most sobering assessment. Gentlemen, I must speak plainly. The Essex-class carrier program represents American industrial capacity operating at perhaps 70% of potential. They have not fully mobilized. They retain substantial civilian automotive production, consumer goods manufacturing, and commercial construction activity. If pressured, they could expand military production further still. Japan has mobilized completely. We've converted every possible industrial facility to military production. We've conscripted every available worker. We're operating at 100% capacity and still being outproduced by a factor of 10 to 1 in most categories. he displayed one final chart. It showed projected carrier strength through 1945. The American line climbed relentlessly. The Japanese line remained essentially flat, unable to replace losses at anything approaching the rate they were being inflicted. This disparity determines everything. Every tactical victory we achieve is temporary. Every ship we sink is replaced within months. Every pilot we kill is replaced by 3 more. The mathematics are inexorable. Unless our strategic situation changes fundamentally, we cannot win a war of attrition against this production base. The officers filed out slowly, each absorbed in private calculations. Some began considering how to present these findings to Imperial General Headquarters. Others calculated their remaining forces and contemplated how best to employ them, knowing replacement was impossible. A few, the most perceptive, recognized that the war's outcome had been determined not at Midway or Guadalcanal, but in American factories and shipyards that Japan could neither destroy nor match. In March 1944, just weeks after this briefing, Admiral Meinechi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, died when his aircraft crashed during a typhoon while relocating headquarters from Palau to Davao. His Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Fukudome, who'd attended Yoshikawa's briefing, survived the crash but was captured by Filipino guerrillas. He was carrying the Z-Plan documents, Japan's comprehensive defensive strategy. Within weeks, those documents reached American intelligence in Brisbane, then Pearl Harbor, giving Admiral Nimitz complete knowledge of Japanese defensive plans. The symmetry was cruel. America now knew Japan's strategy. While Japanese planners fully understood, they faced an opponent whose production capacity made victory mathematically impossible. Both sides possessed complete information. Only one possessed the resources to exploit that knowledge. The first major test came in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet with 9 carriers. Task Force 58 under Admiral Mitcher deployed 15 carriers, including 6 Essex-class vessels. The numbers told most of the story before combat began. Japanese carriers carried 473 aircraft. American carriers embarked 956 aircraft. More than 2-to-1 advantage in aircraft, and the Americans flew newer, better machines flown by better-trained pilots. The battle commenced on June 19th. American radar detected incoming Japanese strikes at distances exceeding 150 miles, giving Mitcher time to launch interceptors and position his combat air patrols optimally. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese attack formations flew into carefully coordinated defensive screens. American F-6F Hellcat fighters, many operating from Essex-class carriers, destroyed Japanese aircraft at ratios exceeding 10-to-1. Of 473 Japanese carrier aircraft committed, 346 were destroyed on June 19th alone. The Essex-class carriers proved their worth repeatedly during this engagement. USS Lexington served as Mitcher's flagship, her combat information center coordinating fleet air defense with unprecedented effectiveness. USS Enterprise and USS Bunker Hill launched repeated strikes that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. The Hellcats they carried climbed faster, flew faster, dove faster than the Zeros opposing them. American pilots exploited vertical advantages the Japanese couldn't counter, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Japanese submarines attempted to attack the American carrier force. USS Kavala torpedoed and sank Shokaku, one of the 2 last remaining carriers from the Pearl Harbor attack force. USS Albacore torpedoed Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier. Secondary explosions from poor damage control sank her hours later. In 2 days, Japan lost 3 fleet carriers and over 600 aircraft. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents during nighttime recovery operations. 0 ships lost. The disparity validated everything Captain Yoshikawa had briefed in February. American carriers operated as a coordinated system. Their radar provided early warning. Their fighter direction officers controlled intercepts with precision. Their damage control teams saved ships that should have sunk. Their logistics train kept them supplied and operational while Japanese forces struggled with fuel shortages. and most critically, American losses were immediately replaceable. Japanese losses were catastrophic and irreversible. Back in Tokyo, naval planners studied the battle reports with grim recognition. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who'd replaced Koga as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, understood the mathematics as clearly as anyone. Japan now possessed 4 operational fleet carriers against 15 American carriers. The ratio would only worsen. By October, 3 more Essex-class carriers would join the Pacific Fleet. Japan had no new carriers scheduled for commissioning. The Imperial Navy's response revealed how thoroughly American production superiority had constrained Japanese options. Unable to match American carriers in combat, they would use them as decoys. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, Ozawa's northern force, with 4 carriers and just 116 aircraft, was deliberately sacrificed to draw American carriers away from the main Japanese surface force attacking the invasion fleet. The strategy worked tactically but failed strategically. American carriers took the bait, pursuing Ozawa north, while Japanese battleships broke through light screening forces and nearly reached the vulnerable transports off Samar. But the sacrifice of Japan's last operational carrier force achieved nothing lasting. American carriers returned south within hours. Japanese battleships were eventually sunk or driven off, and Japan's carrier aviation ceased to exist as a coherent force. USS Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack, sank on October 25, 1944, during the Battle off Cape Engano. She'd been a magnificent ship, veteran of more battles than any other Japanese carrier, but in the end, she was alone against overwhelming numbers. Essex-class carriers Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Intrepid launched strike after strike. Over 200 American aircraft attacked repeatedly. Zuikaku absorbed multiple torpedo and bomb hits before finally capsizing. Her sacrifice brought temporary tactical advantage, but changed nothing strategically. The American carriers she'd helped decoy simply refueled, rearmed, and returned to operations. By November 1944, Japanese carriers no longer existed as an operational force. The 4 carriers that survived Leyte Gulf lacked fuel, aircraft, or trained pilots. They sat in port, effectively useless, while American Essex-class carriers operated at will throughout the Western Pacific. The mathematics Captain Yoshikawa had presented in February had played out exactly as predicted. American carrier production continued accelerating through the end of the war. USS Hancock, commissioned in April 1944, USS Bennington in August, USS Bonhomme Richard in November. Each arrival strengthened American naval superiority, while Japanese defensive capability contracted. By early 1945, Task Force 38 and 58 routinely operated with 12 to 16 carriers, launching strikes of 300 to 500 aircraft against targets that once would have required Japan's entire carrier fleet to attack. The Essex-class carriers raided the Japanese home islands with impunity. They struck Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and other major cities. They sank what remained of the Japanese merchant fleet in harbors, coastal waters. They destroyed Japanese aircraft on airfields before they could launch. American carriers had become mobile airstrips that brought overwhelming combat power to any point in the Pacific within days. No Japanese force could challenge them. No defensive position could withstand them. The vision of carrier-based naval aviation reaching its ultimate expression through American industrial capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of this industrial disparity revealed itself in the desperation of Japan's late-war tactics. With no carriers and few trained pilots remaining, Japanese commanders resorted to kamikaze attacks. If pilots couldn't survive combat anyway, deliberately sacrificing them while doing maximum damage became strategically logical, however horrific. Essex-class carriers became primary targets for these suicide attacks precisely because their importance was so obvious. USS Franklin suffered the most devastating kamikaze hit of any American carrier when a Japanese aircraft struck her on March 19, 1945, while operating off the Japanese coast. Bombs penetrated the flight deck and detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar bays. Fires spread uncontrollably. Over 700 men died in minutes. The damage was catastrophic, worse than anything previously experienced by an American carrier. Yet, Franklin survived. Damage control parties fought fires while the ship listed heavily. Crew members formed human chains to pass ammunition away from fire zones. The engineering spaces remained operational despite severe damage throughout the ship. Franklin made port under her own power after being towed initially. The survival testified to both the robust construction of Essex-class carriers and the extraordinary effectiveness of American damage control training. USS Bunker Hill suffered similar devastating kamikaze hits in May 1945. Again, hundreds died. Again, fires and explosions nearly sank the ship. Again, she survived and reached port for repairs. The pattern demonstrated that even when Japanese attacks succeeded in hitting these carriers, the ships proved incredibly difficult to actually sink. The same robust design philosophy that enabled rapid production also created vessels capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. But kamikaze attacks represented desperation, not strategy. They inflicted casualties and damaged ships, but they didn't change the fundamental equation. For every Essex-class carrier damaged, 3 more operated without interruption. American shipyards repaired damaged vessels with remarkable speed. Service Squadron 10, the mobile repair force attached to the Pacific Fleet, could perform structural repairs that would require months in pre-war shipyards. Floating dry docks accommodated even the largest carriers. Repair ships carried machine tools and skilled technicians. The support infrastructure that kept Essex-class carriers operational was itself a massive advantage Japanese logistics couldn't match. By July 1945, when the planned invasion of Japan loomed, American carrier strength in the Pacific had reached 22 fleet carriers, including 17 Essex-class vessels. This force could launch simultaneous strikes of over 1,000 aircraft against multiple target areas. No defensive position in Japan could withstand such concentration of power. The home islands lay completely vulnerable to carrier-based aviation operating with absolute impunity. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August obviated the invasion, but the carrier force's role in Japan's defeat remained decisive. From mid-1943 through war's end, Essex-class carriers had been the spear point of American offensive power in the Pacific. They'd enabled the island-hopping campaign by providing mobile air support for amphibious landings. They'd destroyed Japanese aviation through systematic elimination of aircraft, pilots, and bases. They'd sunk what remained of the Japanese fleet. They'd struck industrial targets throughout the home islands. No other weapons system contributed more comprehensively to victory. The final accounting revealed the scale of disparity that Captain Yoshikawa's briefing had predicted. The United States commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers during the war, with 7 more completed shortly after. Japan commissioned 1 new fleet carrier, Taiho, during the same period, plus 3 smaller Unryu-class carriers that saw limited action. The production ratio was 17-4, and even that understates American advantages because Essex-class carriers were larger, better protected, carried more aircraft, and operated more effectively than their Japanese equivalents. The industrial philosophy that enabled this production dominated post-war naval thinking. Mass production, standardization, interchangeable parts, design for manufacturability. These principles weren't just American approaches, they became universal best practices. Every major navy studied Essex-class construction methods. The insights influenced Soviet carrier development, British carrier reconstruction, and later French and Italian programs. The recognition that industrial capacity determined naval power more than individual ship quality reshaped strategic thinking globally. Captain Yoshikawa survived the war and found himself interrogated by American intelligence officers in late 1945. They wanted to understand what Japanese naval intelligence had known about American capabilities and when they'd known it. Yoshikawa's answers revealed how thoroughly Japanese planners had understood the situation even while being unable to change it. His February 1944 briefing documents, recovered from naval archives, confirmed that Japan's strategic leadership recognized American industrial superiority 18 months before the war ended. The American officers found this troubling. If Japanese planners knew they couldn't win, why continue fighting? Yoshikawa's answer illuminated a cultural dimension they hadn't fully appreciated. Military honor demanded fighting to the absolute limit. Strategic impossibility didn't justify surrender. The concept of fighting, despite knowing defeat was inevitable, remained alien to American military culture, which emphasized pragmatic calculation over abstract honor. This cultural difference prolonged the war considerably, though Yoshikawa suggested many Japanese officers privately welcomed the atomic bombs as providing a circumstance under which surrender became honorable rather than shameful. Post-war analysis of Japanese carrier development revealed how resource constraints had crippled their construction program. The Unryu-class carriers, designed as simplified versions of the Hiryu, took 22 to 24 months to build. Essex-class carriers averaged 18 to 20 months from keel laying to commissioning despite being larger, more complex ships. American shipyards simply worked faster through systematic application of production techniques Japanese yards never mastered. Construction pace reflected the same fundamental difference Yoshikawa had identified. Japanese shipbuilding remained traditional craftsmanship, while American shipbuilding had become industrial manufacturing. The Essex-class carriers continued serving long after World War II ended. Many received extensive modifications during the 1950s to operate jet aircraft. Angled flight decks, steam catapults, improved arresting gear, strengthened elevators, all were retrofitted to hulls designed in the late 1930s. The basic design proved so fundamentally sound that these modifications extended operational lives by decades. Several Essex-class carriers served in Korea, Vietnam, and through the 1970s. USS Lexington, commissioned in 1943, remained in service as a training carrier until 1991. Nearly 50 years of service testified to the original design's quality, but the true legacy of the Essex-class wasn't longevity. It was the revolution in naval thinking they represented. These carriers demonstrated that industrial capacity could be systematically applied to capital ship construction through careful design choices, prioritizing manufacturability. The airplane and automobile production techniques could translate to shipbuilding if engineers consciously designed for that translation. American naval architects hadn't built the best possible carrier in 1940. They'd built the best carrier that could be mass-produced quickly, and that distinction proved decisive. The philosophical difference extended beyond construction methods. American carrier operations reflected the same systematic thinking. Aircraft maintenance schedules were standardized across the fleet. Spare parts were interchangeable between ships. Operational procedures were documented and taught uniformly. Pilot training emphasized standardized tactics rather than individual improvisation. The entire system was designed so that moderately skilled people following proper procedures could achieve better results than elite individuals operating without systematic support. Japanese carrier operations, by contrast, relied heavily on individual skill and improvisation. Exceptional pilots performed exceptionally, but average pilots struggled. Maintenance required experienced technicians who understood their specific ship's unique characteristics. Operational flexibility came from experienced commanders making intuitive decisions rather than systematic procedures anyone could follow. Under peacetime conditions or early war conditions, when Japan retained its pre-war trained personnel, this approach worked beautifully. Under sustained combat attrition, it collapsed. American systemic superiority manifested in damage control procedures that saved carriers like Franklin and Bunker Hill. Japanese damage control had improved considerably after early war disasters, but it never achieved American effectiveness levels. American carriers trained damage control parties continuously. They ran drills assuming worst-case scenarios. They positioned equipment and personnel based on systematic analysis of fire and flooding hazards. When disaster struck, trained crews followed established procedures that usually worked even under horrific conditions. Japanese damage control remained less systematic, more dependent on individual initiative and improvisation. When Taiho was torpedoed during the Philippine Sea battle, poor damage control decisions led to explosive gasoline vapor accumulation that destroyed the ship hours after the initial hit. An inexperienced damage control officer ordered the ventilation systems opened to clear gasoline fumes, not realizing this spread vapors throughout the ship. A single spark somewhere in that massive vessel ignited the vapor, and secondary explosions destroyed her. Better training and systematic procedures might have saved Taiho. The Essex-class carriers proved that even catastrophic damage could be survivable with proper training and procedures. The strategic calculus Captain Yoshikawa had presented in February 1944 played out with mathematical precision. American carrier strength grew from 11 Essex-class vessels in early 1944 to 17 by war's end. Japanese carrier strength declined from 9 operational carriers in early 1944 to effectively 0 by the end of October. The diverging curves represented different industrial philosophies producing their inevitable outcomes. Mass production overwhelmed elite craftsmanship. Systematic organization defeated individual excellence. Industrial capacity determined strategic outcomes. This realization transformed post-war Japan fundamentally. Japanese industry, forced to rebuild from devastation, studied American production methods intensively. The quality circles, just-in-time manufacturing, and continuous improvement processes that later characterized Japanese manufacturing drew heavily on observations of American wartime production efficiency. The lesson Japanese engineers and managers took from the Essex-class carrier program was that systematic organization of production processes could achieve results individual skill alone could never match. This insight shaped Japanese industrial recovery and eventual emergence as a manufacturing powerhouse. The irony was profound. Japan entered the war confident that superior training, better aircraft, and elite naval forces would overcome American material advantages. By war's end, Japanese survivors recognized that systematic organization mattered more than individual excellence, that production capacity determined strategic outcomes, and that industrial philosophy shaped military effectiveness. These lessons, learned through defeat, became foundations for Japan's post-war economic miracle. The shipyards themselves revealed the disparity most starkly. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, where the first Essex-class carriers were built, had transformed from a commercial operation into a military production facility with remarkable efficiency. By April 1945, Newport News delivered 8 aircraft carriers in less than 30 months, one every 90 days. That production rhythm was sustainable, repeatable, and scalable. USS Essex herself was laid down on April 28, 1941, launched on July 31, 1942, and commissioned on December 31, 1942. 20 months from keel to commissioning, and that was the prototype, the first of her class when production techniques were still being refined. Later vessels were completed even faster. Japanese carrier construction told a different story. Taiho was laid down on July 10, 1941, launched almost 2 years later on April 7, 1943, and finally commissioned on March 7, 1944. 32 months from keel to commissioning, Japan's newest, most advanced carrier took nearly twice as long to build as the prototype Essex, and 60% longer than later Essex-class vessels that benefited from production streamlining. The Unriu-class carriers, designed as simplified, mass-producible fleet carriers to replace losses at Midway, fared no better. Unriu was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on August 1, 1942, and launched on September 25, 1943. She was commissioned in August 1944, meaning 24 months from keel to service. These were supposed to be Japan's answer to American production capacity, simplified designs that could be built quickly. Yet they still took longer to construct than Essex-class carriers, which were larger, more capable, and better protected. Comparing 6 specific carriers, Japanese shipyards built 25.2 tons of Unriu-class carriers per day, while the United States built 52.1 tons of Essex-class carriers per day. American shipyards built twice as much tonnage each day and delivered each ship 24% faster. The disparity wasn't marginal. It was systematic and overwhelming. Japanese naval officers who studied these figures recognized the impossibility of their situation. Admiral Takagi, who'd examined the captured American documents extensively, prepared a supplementary briefing in March 1944, addressing the fundamental question everyone was thinking but few voiced. Can we sink these carriers faster than America builds them? His answer was methodical and devastating. At current loss rates, the Americans are losing approximately one fleet carrier every 6 months. They are completing 4 to 6 fleet carriers every 6 months. The ratio is unsustainable. Even if we double our success rate against American carriers, which is unlikely given improving American defenses, they will still expand their carrier force faster than we can destroy it. He displayed comparative photographs. An Essex-class carrier under construction at Newport News, surrounded by cranes and scaffolding, with hundreds of workers visible on multiple levels. A Japanese carrier at Kure Naval Arsenal, construction proceeding at what appeared to be a much more deliberate pace with fewer workers and less equipment visible. This is not about courage or skill, Takagi continued. Our shipyard workers are excellent, our engineers are competent, but look at the scale. The Americans have mobilized their entire industrial economy. We are approaching our absolute production ceiling. They are operating at perhaps 70% of capacity and still outbuilding us by factors of 5 or more. One officer asked about targeting American shipyards directly. Surely long-range submarine operations could strike at the source? Takagi's response was blunt. American shipyards are on the East Coast and West Coast, thousands of miles from our operational bases. Our submarines lack the range and numbers for sustained operations in American coastal waters. Even if we succeeded in damaging one shipyard, they have 6 others continuing production. We cannot reach their industrial base with sufficient force to matter. The strategic paralysis this created was profound. Japanese naval planning throughout 1944 reflected the recognition that conventional operations couldn't change the fundamental power balance. The Eigo operation, Japan's plan to defend the Marianas, explicitly recognized that one decisive fleet engagement might be Japan's last chance to achieve favorable terms. Everything would be committed, all remaining carriers, all available aircraft, all trained pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 tested that theory against Essex-class capabilities. The results exceeded even pessimistic Japanese expectations. Task Force 58 deployed 15 carriers, including 6 Essex-class vessels. Japanese intelligence had tracked American carrier movements and knew roughly what forces they'd face. What they hadn't fully appreciated was how American radar, fighter direction, and sheer numbers would transform defensive capabilities. American radar detected incoming Japanese strikes at distances exceeding 150 miles. This gave Mitchell time to position his fighters optimally, something Japanese carriers with their inferior radar could never achieve. When Japanese attack formations arrived, they encountered coordinated defensive screens of Hellcat fighters, many launched from Essex-class carriers, positioned at ideal interception altitudes through systematic fighter direction. The massacre that followed cost Japan its last experienced carrier pilots. Of 473 aircraft launched on June 19th, 346 were destroyed. The next day, desperate Japanese attempts to retreat brought American strikes against the mobile fleet. More Japanese carriers sank. More pilots died. By June 21st, Japanese carrier aviation as a coherent force had ceased to exist. Admiral Ozawa's after-action reports, later captured and translated by American intelligence, revealed his understanding of what had occurred. He'd commanded 9 carriers with 473 aircraft against 15 American carriers with 956 aircraft. The 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage would have been manageable with equal quality. But the Americans flew better aircraft, had better radar, employed superior tactics, and could replace losses while Japanese losses were permanent. Ozawa noted specifically that Essex-class carriers operated as an integrated system rather than individual ships. Their radar coordinated to create overlapping coverage. Their fighter directors communicated to ensure optimal use of available interceptors. Their anti-aircraft batteries engaged in coordinated fire rather than independent action. The systematic integration multiplied effectiveness beyond what individual ship capabilities suggested. This was American organizational philosophy applied to naval warfare. Individual Essex-class carriers were excellent ships, but their real power came from how they operated as elements of a larger system. Japan had built carriers as individual capital ships, each somewhat unique, each operated based on its commanding officer's preferences and experience. America had built carriers as standardized units in a fleet system, where procedures, training, equipment, and operations were uniform across all vessels. The implications extended beyond carrier operations. American submarines that had devastated Japanese merchant shipping operated from systematically organized advanced bases. American amphibious operations landed troops using standardized landing craft produced by the thousands. American logistics relied on Liberty ships completed faster than they could be sunk. Every aspect of American Pacific operations reflected industrial organization applied to military problems. Japanese forces, by contrast, improvised constantly. Logistics relied on whatever shipping could be assembled. Equipment varied widely between units based on what was available. Training standards degraded as experienced personnel were consumed, and replacements rushed through abbreviated programs. The systematic organization that amplified American effectiveness was absent from Japanese operations by mid-1944. By October 1944, when the Battle of Leyte Gulf commenced, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated to desperation. The decision to use remaining carriers as decoys during the Northern Force operation revealed how completely Essex-class production had shifted the balance. Ozawa's Northern Force included 4 carriers with just 116 aircraft, deliberately sacrificed to draw American carriers away from the main Japanese surface forces. The sacrifice achieved temporary tactical success. American carriers pursued north, sinking all 4 Japanese carriers. But the strategic outcome remained unchanged. American carriers returned south within hours. Japanese surface forces were eventually driven off or sunk, and Japan's last operational carriers were gone, sacrificed for a tactical diversion that changed nothing. USS Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, sank on October 25th during the battle off Cape Engano. She'd been a magnificent ship, veteran of more battles than any other Japanese carrier, but in the end, numbers overwhelmed quality. Essex-class carriers attacked in waves, launching over 200 aircraft against Ozawa's small force. No amount of courage or skill could survive such disparity. The final months of 1944 saw Essex-class carriers operating with complete freedom throughout the Western Pacific. They struck the Philippines repeatedly, supporting MacArthur's return. They attacked Formosa, destroying Japanese air bases. They raided the Ryukyus, cutting supply lines to Japan's southern defenses. No Japanese force could challenge them. No defensive position could withstand them. American production continued accelerating even as victory became inevitable. USS Hancock commissioned in April 1944, USS Bennington in August, USS Bonhomme Richard in November. Each new carrier strengthened Task Force 38's already overwhelming power. By early 1945, American commanders had more carriers available than target areas required. The desperation of Japan's response manifested in kamikaze operations, with no carriers and few trained pilots remaining. Deliberately sacrificing pilots while doing maximum damage became strategically logical, however horrific. Essex-class carriers, because of their obvious importance, became primary targets. USS Franklin suffered the most devastating attack when a Japanese aircraft struck her on March 19, 1945, while operating off the Japanese coast. Bombs penetrated the flight deck and detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. Secondary explosions ripped through hangar bays. Fires spread with terrifying speed. Over 700 men died in minutes. The damage was catastrophic, worse than anything previously experienced by an American carrier. Yet Franklin survived. Damage control parties fought fires, while the ship listed dangerously. Crew members formed human chains, passing ammunition away from fire zones. Engineering spaces remained operational despite severe damage throughout the ship. Franklin came home under her own power and was successfully repaired even after receiving extremely heavy damage. The survival testified to both robust construction and extraordinary damage control training. USS Bunker Hill suffered similar devastating kamikaze hits in May 1945. Again, hundreds died. Again, fires and explosions nearly sank the ship. Again, she survived and reached port for repairs. During the war, none of the Essex-class carriers were lost to enemy action, despite many receiving heavy damage. The design philosophy that enabled rapid production also created vessels capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. But kamikaze attacks represented final desperation, not a viable strategy. For every Essex-class carrier damaged, 3 more operated without interruption. American shipyards repaired damaged vessels with remarkable speed. The support infrastructure keeping Essex-class carriers operational was itself a massive advantage Japanese logistics couldn't match. Captain Yoshikawa, who'd briefed Japanese admirals in February 1944 about Essex-class capabilities, survived the war and found himself interrogated by American intelligence officers. They wanted to understand what Japanese naval intelligence had known, and when. Yoshikawa's answers, documented in interrogation transcripts, revealed how thoroughly Japanese planners had understood their situation. The American officers found this troubling. If Japanese planners knew they couldn't win, why continue fighting? Yoshikawa's explanation illuminated cultural dimensions they hadn't fully appreciated. Military honor demanded fighting to the absolute limit. Strategic impossibility didn't justify surrender. We understood we would lose. But understanding loss and accepting surrender are different matters. Japanese military culture doesn't surrender, while capability to resist remains, however futile that resistance may be. He added, "The atomic bombs provided circumstances under which surrender became honorable rather than shameful. Without them, the war would have continued despite everyone understanding the outcome was predetermined." This cultural reality, alien to American pragmatic thinking, explained why a war Japan knew it couldn't win continued for 18 months after the Philippine Sea disaster. Post-war analysis of Japanese carrier development revealed how completely resource constraints had crippled their construction program. Japan projected 21 aircraft carriers as new construction to replace war losses and augment the fleet. Of these, only 4 were ever completed, and only 2 ever put to sea. Only one, Taiho, operated with the fleet. The contrast with American production was stark and final. The Unryu-class carriers, designed as mass-producible vessels, never achieved their intended production numbers. 14 ships were originally planned, but only 3 were completed. Those 3 saw minimal service. Unryu was commissioned in August 1944, but fuel and aircrew shortages limited her use to Japanese waters. She was sunk in December 1944 while transporting supplies to the Philippines, having never engaged in actual carrier operations. Her sisters Amagi and Katsuragi survived the war, but never became operational for lack of fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots. The mathematical certainty Captain Yoshikawa had presented played out exactly as predicted. Japan, operating at maximum industrial capacity, could not build carriers faster than they were being destroyed, while simultaneously replacing aircraft, training pilots, and maintaining surface forces. America, operating well below maximum capacity, expanded carrier strength continuously, while maintaining all other military programs and substantial civilian production. By July 1945, when the planned invasion of Japan loomed, American carrier strength in the Pacific reached 22 fleet carriers, including 17 Essex-class vessels. This force could launch simultaneous strikes of over 1,000 aircraft against multiple target areas. No defensive position in Japan could withstand such concentration of power. The home islands lay completely vulnerable to carrier-based aviation, operating with absolute impunity. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August obviated the invasion, but the carrier force's role in Japan's defeat remained decisive. From mid-1943 through war's end, Essex-class carriers had been the spearpoint of American offensive power in the Pacific. They'd enabled the island-hopping campaign through mobile air support. They destroyed Japanese aviation through systematic elimination of aircraft, pilots, and bases. They'd sunk what remained of the Japanese fleet. They'd struck industrial targets throughout the home islands. The final accounting revealed the scale of disparity Yoshikawa had identified. The United States commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers during the war, with 7 more completed shortly after. 24 total, the most numerous class of capital ships in the 20th century. Japan commissioned 1 new fleet carrier during the same period, Taiho, which operated for 3 months before being sunk. The production ratio was 24-1. The industrial philosophy enabling this production became universal post-war practice. Mass production, standardization, interchangeable parts, design for manufacturability. These principles weren't just American approaches. They became global standards. Every major navy studied Essex-class construction methods. Soviet carrier development reflected American influence. British carrier reconstruction adopted American techniques. The insights gained from defeating Japan influenced global manufacturing. The Essex-class carriers themselves continued serving decades after World War II ended. Many received extensive modifications during the 1950s to operate jet aircraft. Angled flight decks, steam catapults, improved arresting gear, strengthened elevators, all were retrofitted to hulls designed in the late 1930s. Several served in Korea, Vietnam, and through the 1970s. USS Lexington, commissioned in 1943, remained in service as a training carrier until 1991. Nearly 50 years of service, an extraordinary operational lifespan that testified to fundamental design soundness. The philosophy of building for manufacturability rather than perfection produced vessels that proved remarkably adaptable to changing requirements. Japanese survivors who'd studied American equipment during captivity returned home with insights that shaped reconstruction. The systematic organization they'd observed in American motor pools, shipyards, and logistics operations became models for Japanese industrial recovery. Quality circles, just-in-time manufacturing, continuous improvement processes that later characterized Japanese manufacturing drew heavily on observations of American wartime production efficiency. The lesson Japanese engineers and managers learned from Essex-class production was profound. Systematic organization of production processes could achieve results individual skill alone never matched. This insight, gained through defeat, became the foundation for Japan's post-war economic miracle. Japan entered the war confident that superior training and elite forces would overcome material advantages. By war's end, Japanese survivors recognized that systematic organization mattered more than individual excellence. The irony shaped post-war relations fundamentally. American occupation authorities encouraged Japanese industrial recovery using American organizational methods. Japanese manufacturers studied American production techniques intensively. The synthesis of Japanese precision with American systematic organization created approaches that eventually made Japan a global manufacturing powerhouse. By the 1970s, when the last Essex-class carriers were being retired from American service, Japan had become one of the world's leading economies. Japanese automotive companies exported millions of vehicles annually, using production methods that owed much to lessons learned studying American wartime manufacturing. The defeat that had seemed so catastrophic in 1945 had become the foundation for prosperity by implementing insights gained from the victor. Captain Yoshikawa's February 1944 briefing had predicted Japan's defeat through industrial disparity. His analysis proved completely accurate, but the knowledge gained from that defeat, the understanding that systematic organization and production efficiency mattered more than traditional craftsmanship, served Japan better in peace than wartime hubris had served in conflict. The story of Japanese naval intelligence discovering Essex-class capabilities is ultimately about learning through defeat. Pride told them Japanese quality would triumph over American quantity. Reality taught otherwise. Essex-class carriers weren't better engineered than Japanese equivalents in most individual specifications. They were better designed for mass production and systematic operation. That difference, multiplied by American industrial capacity, created overwhelming material superiority. The 872-foot flight deck wasn't just a measurement. It was a symbol of systematic production applied to naval warfare. Each Essex-class carrier represented the American ability to mobilize entire industries for military production. Each represented design philosophy, prioritizing manufacturability over perfection. Each represented organizational systems that made adequate equipment operated by well-trained but not elite personnel more effective than sophisticated equipment operated by exceptional individuals. Japanese admirals who examined the captured plans in February 1944 understood this immediately. The realization that America could build these massive carriers in 18 to 20 months, that production was accelerating rather than plateauing, that no Japanese response could match this capacity, determined their strategic calculations for the remainder of the war. Every subsequent battle occurred within the context established by those production figures. Japan fought knowing each loss was irreplaceable, while American losses were temporary setbacks. Japanese pilots flew knowing they faced overwhelming numbers. Japanese sailors served knowing their ships operated without adequate support. The psychological impact of fighting against an opponent whose resources seemed infinite shaped every decision. The final truth Captain Yoshikawa had presented remained unassailable. Unless Japan's strategic situation changed fundamentally through diplomatic settlement or American political collapse, industrial disparity determined the outcome. No amount of courage, skill, or tactical brilliance could overcome mathematics. America could produce faster than Japan could destroy. That simple fact explained everything that followed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.